Hello, guests coming in. Thank you all for being here today. Gonna let everybody come in. Yes, if everybody can mute, please. Muting, great. Okay. All right, we're gonna get started. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to today's program, Traveling Through Time with 3G. My name is Sophie Don, and I am a board member and the program committee chair for 3G Philly. Before we get started with the program, I want to give a big thanks to all of our presenters today for sharing stories with us. I'd also like to thank my fellow board members, Cindy and Stacy, for helping to put this program together. So to give some context for this event, I want to share with you a little bit about 3G Philly, but also 3G in general, because we have some representation from a few different chapters here, and let you know a little bit about who we are. So 3G is a group or a grouping of groups of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So meaning our grandparents were the youngest surviving generation of the Holocaust. And our mission is to honor our grandparents' memories and legacies through education and advocacy and peer support in order to uphold the pledge of never again. We have been in existence, the 3G Philly branch that I'm a part of. We've been in existence for a few years now, and we're working to create spaces for 3Gs in the Philadelphia region. There are 3G chapters all around the nation, and we often partner with our peer regional groups for programs. And we're honored to present this program in partnership with our friends in Boston and in Miami. As part of the charge to educate and to advocate, we support programs that make spaces to share about our families and about our own lives. So how we experience the world through the lens of, being the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So some survivors, they wrote poetry, memoirs, fiction, made art about their lives to share their stories with their families and with the broader public. Some returned to the places in Europe that were important to their own lives, before the war, during the war, and after the war. And then many children of survivors wrote about their parents' experiences, and they visited some of these places, and ultimately took up the mantle of educating and storytelling when they entered adulthood. And now the 3Gs have come into adulthood, and the torch is passing along from survivors to 2Gs to 3Gs. And now, as 3Gs, we're writing and retelling our grandparents' stories, and are also writing about our own relationships to our grandparents and to our parents. So today, we're going to hear from 4 3Gs who are exploring their family histories and identities through travel to places where family history took place. For this program, I'm going to be introducing each of our speakers, and then they'll present for about 10, 12 minutes. And then we'll have time for questions for the group and for some open Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask the group, please feel free to just put it in the chat. Let me know if you would like me to ask the question on your behalf, or if you would like to unmute and ask it yourself. And then we'll have that, you'll have that opportunity during the Q&A portion towards the end. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Let me also say this program is being recorded so that those folks that were not able to join us live can watch this later on. So I will introduce our first speaker. First, we'll be hearing from Lisa Einstein. Lisa is the granddaughter of 2 Hungarian Holocaust survivors and one of the founding members of Boston 3G. Her close relationship with her grandmother inspired her passion and drive in helping keep the memory and lessons of the Holocaust alive. Lisa has also served as the chair of the Greater Boston Yom HaShoah Commemoration and a committee member for the New England Holocaust Memorial. Lisa resides in the suburbs of Boston, where she's joining us from today, with her husband and 3 kids, and works as a marketing consultant. She has her bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in marketing. And when she's not volunteering or chasing after her kids, she enjoys singing in her a cappella group, Sheer Rhythm, which is great. Great. I love honey group titles, or hiking with her dog. She'll be discussing her trip to Hungary to visit her grandparents' towns, homes, stores, etc., all of these different spaces. So Lisa. I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Share my screen here. Give me 1 second and hopefully, can you see it? You're good? All right. Thank you so much, Sophie. Like Sophie said, I'm going to be sharing today about a trip going back to Hungary. I actually have been back to Hungary as well as Austria, where my husband's family is from, but I'm going to focus today on just the Hungary piece. So here we go. So this is a little map of kind of where our trip was. We started down here in Szeged, went up to Budapest, and then went over here, which is where my family was from. Really, the start of the trip was that my dad was giving a scientific lecture in Hungary. I overheard this, and I decided that I wanted to tag along. So that's how the whole conversation began. And I was looking forward to, seeing this place that my grandmother was born, that her family was from, but that she hated and would never go back to. She wasn't very fond of the Hungarians, of what they did to her after the war. So going to Hungary, this was kind of our first stop. It was my parents, my brother, and I. We all met in Hungary. Again, the beginning of this was for a scientific conference. So this is my dad and my mom. They're actually on the call. Hi, mom and dad. But one of the very first things we did was to get to know the Hungarian culture. We stopped at a local restaurant where, they had all the traditional goulash and stuffed cabbage, palacsinta, which was something that my savta, that's grandmother in Hebrew, always used to make us. Whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, we ate palacsinta all day, all night. It was kind of a special thing in our family. And now, my brother, my husband, my kids, we all continue the tradition of making palacsinta. So to have it in a restaurant was a lot of fun. Interesting enough, while we were in the restaurant, you can see right here. Can you see my pointer? You can see it, right? There's this red pot which you collect lard in. And so here, this is me here in my home. This is one of the very few things I have from my grandmother from Hungary is her red pot to collect the lard in. And this is me in Hungary. It was sitting right next to us in the restaurant. So I kind of took that as a sign that my grandma was there with us, it was just really cool to see. So we're down here in Szeged. My mom and I decided we wanted to, go see the sights. So we headed up to Budapest. So we took the train to Budapest because that's what you do in Europe. We didn't really think anything of it. We kind of boarded, walked past the bicycle room, which was just a big empty room, sat down, started chatting, and then really started to get this sinking feeling in the fact that, my mother's entire family, boarded a cattle train and were taken to Auschwitz. And this was kind of like the end of their freedom. So for us, who was taking a train ride to Budapest, for a day of sightseeing, it was a very different train ride for my grandmother and her family. So it was a little bit of an eerie feeling for us. And that bicycle room really kind of stirred us because it really reminded you of a cattle train. And, just starting to think back to my Savta didn't realize, where she would end up. They had no idea where they were going. So we got to Budapest. We asked around looking for the great synagogue, the Dohani Synagogue in Budapest. My mom speaks some Hungarian because her parents used to speak it. So she dusted off that side of her brain and started asking some of the locals where we could find a synagogue. She was a bit scared, I have to say, and apprehensive, just to be a Jew back in Hungary and speaking Hungarian and asking people where the synagogue was. We weren't really sure how people were going to take to us. But they were friendly for the most part and directed us to the synagogue. We went to the Jew Inform to get more information and took a quick tour of the Dohani Synagogue. So before the Second World War, there was actually 750,000 Jews living in Hungary, and 200,000 of them lived in Budapest alone. So this synagogue was built in 1854. And it could hold 3,000 people at a time. It was actually the largest synagogue in Europe, seating 3,000 people. Whoops, I went the wrong way. During World War II, the synagogue in the area became the Jewish ghetto in Budapest. 10,000 people actually died in the ghetto alone. In total, there's actually about 600,000 Hungarian Jews victims of the Holocaust. And this is the courtyard of the synagogue. It was originally planned as a garden, but now it's the resting and burial place of about 2,600 people who died in the ghetto between 1944 and 1945. So you can see it's become a burial place. Part of this complex is also the Raoul Wallenberg Memorial Park. He saved thousands of Jews. And so this is a courtyard near the synagogue that really, holds a memorial for the martyrs and the people that, saved the Jews. So they have a weeping willow, and the leaves actually have inscriptions of the names of all of the victims on each leaf. So we went to the gift shop. Interestingly enough, my mom started to chat it up with the guy who was the owner of the gift shop, and we soon realized it was our cousin. We had no idea. It was like a married, it was like my cousin's wife's father. But it just kind of made the connection that, all Jews are really connected and all related. And it was amazing with such a small world. We went back to Szeged on the train to where my dad was, giving his conference, saw some traditional Hungarian dancing. We took a tour. Again, here's the red pot in one of our tours. We went to see, what life was like in the old days. Stopped for some palachinta, obviously, because that was a huge part. And then someone told us on our tour, they said, "Have you seen the synagogue yet?" And I said, "No, I haven't seen the synagogue. Where would we see it?" But that night we actually were going to a concert, and it happened to be at the synagogue. So the synagogue is now a concert hall, which is beautiful. It's all completely redone. It looks like a Roman cathedral. It's magnificent. Inside, it still looks like a synagogue. You have the menorahs, you have the ark, you have the bima. Everything is still as it was. The inside, it's made of marble and wood from the banks of the Nile and stained glass. I mean, it must have cost a ton to, put this together back in the day. Again, now it's a synagogue. These were all concert goers in here. What I thought was interesting was that, these concert goers, there are not a lot of Jews in Hungary or in Szeged, but they put on kippas while they were in here to listen to the concert, which I thought was really interesting and really respectful. So I sat here, looking around, and I found it ironic. I saw this. So this is Hungarian Hebrew, and it says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And one of the things that my grandma always talked about is that, like, her neighbors, like, turn them in. Her neighbors, were so scared. They no longer could play with them anymore. They no longer, could associate with them anymore. So she was angry at the Hungarians, for not doing more. So that kind of was a lot to see. And then here you'll see a picture of the synagogue from 1944. They actually used it as a furniture warehouse during the war. So we sat there, and, as everyone else was listening to this beautiful organ concert, I myself was, saying every prayer I could possibly think about, because I was in a synagogue that hadn't been used in a synagogue in however many years. And it was just a surreal experience. So from Budapest, we were now ready to really get started with the family piece of the trip. So my brother joined us. Here he is. We saw some of the sites, did all the checklists of must-sees. One of the things on the checklist was the Shoes Memorial. What's interesting is we asked a bunch of people if they knew where it was. Nobody knew. We checked our tourist maps, that have the pictures on them of all the different tourist spots. Nothing about the Shoes Memorial. finally, we found a hotel concierge who was able to send us to the riverbank. It's really in the middle of nowhere. It's across like a 4-lane highway in front of the Parliament. But the memorial symbolizes when the Jews were brought to the river, told to take off their shoes, and then shot dead at the river's edge. So you'll see like flowers, and sometimes there are yahrzeit candles. And this is kind of a view. You can see it's on the side of this highway, and it's really just, there's no other sign except for this plaque in Hebrew, which says in memory of the victims who were shot and murdered on the Danube. I thought that was really interesting. There's nothing in Hungarian, there's nothing in English. It's not on any tourist map. It's just kind of like something over on the side, which for me was upsetting. Here in Boston, we have the Freedom Trail, and our Holocaust Memorial is right on the Freedom Trail for like everyone to see in the heart of downtown. So you have no choice but to see it. So I thought that was really interesting. So literally, we saw antique stores everywhere. My mom and I wandered into one of them, and we were shocked because they were just overflowing with Judaica. There were menorahs and dreidels and yads and spice boxes and mezuzahs. The girl in the shop didn't even have any idea what these things were. There was even a place in the Jewish quarter we found that was selling old nameplates from people's doors. So that was a little eerie because clearly we knew what all this stuff was and where it came from. Here's the mezuzahs. These are just some pictures of the Jewish quarter in Budapest, some of the old synagogues. I'm gonna go through this. So from Budapest, we went up to Miskolc, which is where my grandfather's family was from. My grandmother lived there as well. So our first stop was actually to the synagogue in town. It was a gated synagogue. So we entered through the gate and we knocked on some doors so that we could get in, and we found a young woman, asked her some questions, and she let us in and actually was able to open the synagogue for us. This man here is actually the one Jew in town. He's in charge of the synagogue and the complex, so he showed us around a little bit. It was gorgeous, a beautiful synagogue, but this one was in disrepair. It was creaky floorboards, everything was dusty, it was no longer used. And it was just amazing because this is, my grandparents were Orthodox, and so they went to Shabbat and prayed here every single Saturday. And so to be in the same place where them and their family and my great grandparents was really incredible. So we walked around. We learned that before the war, there was about 10,000 people in the Miskolc area. Afterwards, only about 1,600 returned alive. And today, there's about 200 people remaining, although most of them are not practicing Jews, or they're they were hidden children. So from here, the one Jewish guy in charge took us into a back room in the synagogue. And it was just books, dusty books, and there was just random Torahs, and there was no rhyme or reason. And basically, he asked us what our family names were. So we told him. He grabbed a book, this book in particular, and he produced my grandparents' marriage certificate. It was absolutely amazing. This is actually the only marriage certificate that they have. It includes all of their information. It has my Saba's information as a coal miner and my great grandparents' names, their signatures, and it's in this book falling apart, on the shelf of this synagogue. And this is where my grandparents were married. It was really amazing to see. He then brought another book out, a book of births, and he found my uncle's birth certificate from 1946. So right after the war, my grandparents got married and had a baby to start their life over, where my uncle was born in Hungary. And this was his birth certificate in this dusty book. So I actually asked them, do these documents live anywhere else, like in City Hall or any other institutions? And he basically said to me, no, they don't matter to anyone else. These old books were actually manned by this one volunteer, were the only records kept. This was their official birth certificate and marriage certificate. So here's my grandparents. There's my Uncle Peter. There was a memorial as well with names of my family that were killed in Auschwitz at the site. And then this man again went to show us the Jewish ghetto of Miskolc. There was a sign there, and so we just got a little look. This is my family from Miskolc. We then went to go find my grandfather's house. It was a bit of a scavenger hunt. We had photos from years ago from when other family had gone to visit, and we were able to actually find their house from the pictures. We visited the cemeteries in town. Here you see, the Jewish cemetery all beat up, but my family had actually put a new gravestone for my great grandfather in the cemetery. So that was nice. Stopped for some palatine, of course, with my brother. And then we were on to my grandmother's town. So here we are in Miskolc. We went to Serench next, which is where she was from. So we took a drive through the farmland, a lot of wide open space. This is my grandma and her family. This was 1936, 1940. This is my Softa. And the first stop was we went looking for her family's store. So this is them. This is my grandma, the little baby right here. And Shamish Arpad is my great-grandfather. So this is his store. And it was a very fancy, store on the main street of town. It sold porcelain and fine china. And so we basically just drove to the main street and started looking for these windows. And we found them. It was a Chinese bazaar now. We went inside to go shopping, and we told the owners a little bit about our story, and they were not very friendly at all. I think they thought we were there to take back our property of something of the sort. Oh, you can see my notes, huh? Sorry. I guess that's okay. But sorry. So the Chinese bazaar, they weren't very friendly. They didn't really want us looking around. They didn't want us taking pictures. I tried to peek into the backyard, which is the courtyard where my grandparents, spent a lot of time. And they kept shooing us out of there. So from there, we did ask my mom in Hungarian, did this used to be a porcelain shop? And there was a woman who was older who was there. She was one of the customers. And she told us that, yes, in fact, it had. And she, remembered the shop as a child and told us to go around back, that there was a restaurant in back. So this restaurant was actually my grandmother's house. We went in, had some palatita, of course. They were much friendlier in the restaurant, let us go into the courtyard, which is, again, where my grandma and her family spent much of their time. So this is my grandma and family in the courtyard. And interesting enough, like I said, the Chinese bazaar, the courtyard was divided into 4 different houses now. They had split it up and sold it. And not everyone, so they wouldn't let us in the backyard. But this is actually my cousin. So my cousins took a trip here in 2023. And it was no longer a Chinese bazaar. It was a different store. And so they let them into the backyard. And this is a well that my grandmother always used to talk about. It was still there. And this is like an old cave that goes underground. So my cousin actually went into the storage cave. They used to store their food there. And he found this piece of pottery. And if you can see, it says S-E-L-Y. So Shamish, S-E-L-Y-M-E-S, was their last name. So this was a piece of pottery that he found in 2023 from my great-grandfather's store. Took a quick trip to the chocolate factory, which is what Serench was known for. And then over to the train station. Again, the train station and the trains in Hungary were really hard for us. My grandmother used to tell the story. So her and her family was all sent to Auschwitz. Her 2 younger brothers and mother were killed immediately in the gas chambers. And then her father and her oldest brother, she knew they were in Auschwitz and had survived at least the initial sorting, and her three sisters were with her as well. So people had seen them in Auschwitz, and so she knew they were alive. And so every day they went back to the Serinch train station to wait for their family to come back. And every day they sent someone to the train station waiting. They later found out that her father and her brother were killed on the last day, the day that the Russians were coming to liberate Auschwitz. So these are the four sisters that survived that I've been talking about. This is who perished, her brothers and her parents, and a lot of the rest of her family. We went looking for the synagogue in Serinch. It was no more. It's a pile of bricks, not even a plaque. And then on our last day there, we drove up north, right here, to the city of Treese, which is where my great-grandparents were from. We drove up to the cemetery on a hill and we found them, which was interesting. There were basically 4 very old gravestones with Hebrew writing, and then the rest were all, a Christian, a brand new cemetery. But over here on the corner were these 4 old Jewish gravestones. We went looking for my great-grandparents, place. And again, we had photos to come from. We found this old water pipe. And from there, we were able to surmise that this was actually their house. The store next door was a supermarket. It used to be their bar that they had. And this was a really small town. There was about 200 people or so, I think, living in this town. It was like just a few square miles. So people were looking at us like, who are these people? So it got to the point where the locals came and they actually started talking with us. The mayor wanted to come and have us for tea. And they knew our family. They called this the Shamish house. So they actually knew our family, and it was a well-known house, and we're a well-known family in the town, and they invited us back, and we were kind of treated like royalty, which was very interesting. So here's the Shamish family from Treese. And then our last stop, we went to Egtella Cave. This is the last picture that I have of our family before they were taken to Auschwitz. So this is in 1943. They used to vacation at these caves, both my grandmother's side of the family and my grandfather's side of the family. And so here they are having a picnic, and then here's my family having a picnic. We tried to find the same place. And then again, this is the last photo we have of a lot of these people. They were killed in the Holocaust. This is my grandma here, but they were trying to set up a shidduch between the Reisners and the Shamishes. And that's what this trip was about in 1943. And eventually after the war, my grandmother ended up marrying their family friends, the Reisners, and my grandma's sister ended up marrying his brother, and we had a very close relationship. And so after those who survived Auschwitz were able to remarry. So our trip ended here with some more palatchinta, and just a little family tree. Kind of, this is the family after the war. 4 sisters survived the Holocaust, and from that, 77 people and counting were able to have their lives. Here's my grandma with us and my family. And then here's the family tree. And really, this trip brought about a ton of emotions, good and bad. It was beautiful. Hungary is an absolutely beautiful place. It was an emotional journey, but I had decided that I never want to go back, that was enough for me. So I think, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism that we, kept hearing about and experiencing while we were there. And so I decided, done, check, we've done Hungary. But what's interesting is, and really quick, last year, this is actually my husband's family. We went to Austria, where his family's from. They left the night of Kristallnacht. And while we were there, we kept running on these are called Stolpersteins, stones of remembrance. And all over Austria, they had these which basically say, you know, like here lied, or here's the last living residence of, and then it had someone's name from the war. And so I looked into it when I got home, and I looked into if Hungary did it. And I actually, since then, have been able to, I purchased and got Serenc, the town's approval, and they'll be installing a Stoppel stone in front of my grandfather's store. So it's kind of like full circle, bringing me back. And I might actually go back when that ceremony happens next year to kind of honor that. So that's my trip.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And what a beautiful kind of ending to that, I think, to that entire presentation. But I do hope that you get to go back for the ceremonial like placement of it. That's really beautiful. Thank you so much. We're going to move to our next speaker. Remember, anybody, if you have any questions, you know, feel free to let me know in the chat. We're going to hear from our next speaker, who's Becky Newman. Becky is a 3G who grew up in the Philadelphia suburb of Cheltenham, PA, just like me. Her maternal grandparents were the sole survivors of their families living in small villages and cities outside of Warsaw, Poland. Their families were murdered at Treblinka and in the Lodz ghetto. Becky's grandparents emigrated to the US after the war and lived in Pittsburgh. Becky attended Cornell University and the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, resided in Los Angeles for 15 years and worked in the fields of public interest law and philanthropy. And then in summer 2022, Becky and her family relocated to Valencia, Spain, where she works remotely and continues to pursue passions for travel, cultural and language immersion, and learning and discovery. In the past few years, she's prioritized travels to museums and sites that are connected with the Holocaust in numerous European countries, including Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The main focus of her discussion today is going to be on a long-anticipated journey to Poland that took place this past summer 2023, with her mother. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Becky, but I am going to share my screen. So let me just get set up over here. Becky, if you want to start
Oh, sure.
introducing
Okay.
yourself, please feel free.
Well, I'm glad to be here and happy to have the connection to 3G Philly, especially given the time difference with 3G LA. So I'm 6 hours ahead of you instead of 9 hours ahead. But I really enjoyed being connected with the chapter and the work that you all do. I'm a third generation grandchild of Polish Holocaust survivors. You can go to the next slide. So this is the only photo that we have of my grandfather's family. My grandfather is the young boy on the far right. His name was Abraham Yitzhak Solomon. And this was his family. They lived in a small town called Vengrove, which was about a hour, 15-minute, hour and a half outside of Warsaw to the east. He actually changed his name from Solomon to Salem after the war for the cigarette brand, in order to assimilate more in the US, and also because he, like many, faced a lot of anti-Semitism when he came to the US. These were his parents. A few of his siblings pictured. He actually had 6 siblings. One died before the war, and then the woman who's standing in the back was a cousin, Esther. You can go to the next slide. And this is just a little more information about my grandfather. He actually wrote his own memoir of sorts, which is on the photo on the right. It's the back cover of the book. about his experiences, about his survival story. He was the only survivor of his family, and his obituary, which it's a little hard to read, but and he died in 2017. And you can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to give a little bit of this information because the woman that I mentioned, the cousin Esther, who was in that photo, she immigrated to the US before the war. She was the only other survivor from my grandfather's family, or survivor, but the only other person who, blood relative of his, who survived the war. So this newspaper clipping from the 1960s was actually about how there was a group that helped to connect survivors who were in the US, some of the different refugee committees. And it talked about how Esther Tuchman, his cousin, they helped her find Abe, my grandfather, and connect them. And Esther Tuchman lived in Detroit, and she also wrote this article for her synagogue, I think, which mentioned this town, Kosovlaki. And that was the first that I had really learned about, I guess, the surrounding towns. We always thought my grandfather, where he was from, was called, in his book, he said Vengerov, but it was really Vengrove. And so there was a short way of just saying there's a lot of digging that had to be done. It's very difficult with a lot of these names and towns. But they were, able to connect after the war. You can go to the next slide. And this is my grandfather. And then this photo on the right is my cousin, Mike, who was the grandson of Esther. And he found us because he found this newspaper article online. And he was able to reconnect with our family and Abe, actually just before he died. And go to the next slide. So, and next slide. So, I've done a lot of travel in Europe, visited a lot of places. My grandfather's never wanted to go back to Poland. Never wanted to, never wanted to go back at all. Like many people, he felt he had a lot of anger and resentment and rage, particularly towards the Poles. So, and his family were murdered at Treblinka, which was actually only 17 miles from the town that he lived. And so I have a map here where you can see Treblinka. And if you go to the next slide, you could see the train lines and how close Kosov was to Treblinka. And they were actually, the story was that on Yom Kippur 1942, they were actually marched from the town 17 miles to Treblinka and killed there. Go to the next slide. And so last summer, my family, we decided to go back to Poland. And we did a lot of different travel around, but as I mentioned, I'm just focusing on our visit to Treblinka here. So Treblinka is one of, certainly because it was an extermination camp, because it was only created for the purpose of killing as many Jews as possible. There's really very little remaining there. There are no buildings. There's really nothing there. The Nazis destroyed everything after the camp was in operation for 1942 and then 1943. So there's, when you go, it's, even though there's a small museum, we hired a tour guide with the museum, which I really recommended just in order to kind of walk through the history and also to be able to explain our family connection to the guide who was from Kosovlaki himself. And he helped us to kind of, ensure that we were able to see what we wanted to see and, have a meaningful experience visiting there. But these are just some of the signs and memorial. And you go to the next slide. And this is in the museum. It's really just one room. It's very small. It's not like visiting some of the other camps where some of the buildings remained, where they had more records that remained, or lots of other grounds that you can walk, like in Dachau or Auschwitz. It's very small. And this was our guide, Pavel, and explaining to us, they have a kind of a setup of the camp. And so we had him as our private tour guide when we went there. Next slide. And, as I mentioned, there's nothing that remains, but symbolically, this is where they put down the large stones for the train tracks that led into the camp, and then just the stone markers of where the cars stopped. Next slide. And this is my mom and our guide, Pavel, walking towards the main memorial. Next slide. And as you can see, I mean, it's really hard to get a sense, but I mean, there are 17,000 stones. And there was meant to symbolize the number of people who were killed on a given day in the camp's operation. And this field of stones, each of the stones, or many of the stones, have the name of a town, because we don't have the names of everybody that was murdered there. Even in the records that they had, they couldn't even find our family members' names. So it was just, we didn't, it was a very different experience to go and to try to commemorate and to remember really how they died. We didn't know very much about how they lived. We only knew kind of from what my grandfather told us of his family. And he talked about his family and his experiences, but it was just very, very powerful to be there, and certain, and also for my mom as their child of survivors. And so it's me and my mom in the field. And if go to the next slide. That's my mom next to the stone for Vengrove. It, as I mentioned, it's hard to describe, what it felt to be there, except it just was very emotional. It felt like a part of me. It felt like a connection to walk in these grounds, even though there was so little there. And because there's so little evidence of the crimes committed, and they're actually still conducting excavations there. You just have the memorial. You can go to the next slide. And as a result of these experiences of being in Europe, and kind of the process of why we chose to relocate here, and also to be able to capture more about the themes and different reflections that I've had of doing this travel, I actually decided to start a blog. And so I wrote more about these experiences. This is just about some of the other travel that we did in Poland. We were in Krakow, we were in Warsaw, trying to get a better sense of the experience in Warsaw, where my grandfather had lived for a period of time before he escaped. And there was a lot more to see in Poland, of course, than just the sites related to the Holocaust. But that being said, it did feel very different experience being there as a descendant. The way that they tell their experience of the war is, I think, very different maybe than what I understood, and from my grandfather and my grandparents' experience. And as you visit different museums and sites, it's I think there's a lot of deflection and blame on the Russians, because they were, because they were invaded on both sides. There's a lot of focus on what the Russians did and the Germans, but not about what the Poles did. And at least what my grandfather's experience was the amount of, for many people, the collaboration and the bystanding and the complicity in many of the crimes. So these were a lot of sort of things that we noticed and felt as we traveled through. Go to the next slide. I am coming up on time, so I won't, go through some of the different other travel that we did. As I mentioned, we went to a few other cities and regions in Poland. But just think, having so little in terms of the photographs and only really having oral history, interviews, trying to make sense of this through our own personal processes, my mother's process, and working with the Transcending Trauma Project in Philadelphia, doing interviews, working with the Shoah Foundation. For me, I was interviewed as a 3G when I was a teenager, and again, as in my early 20s. But it just continues to be a process of travel and reflection. And I find that going to these places is very meaningful, and I'm continuing to discover and find things. And we weren't able to go to Łódź, which is where my grandmother's family was from on this trip, but I hope we'll be able to go back there at another point. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. I appreciate it. Let me switch some things around. Let me see where I am. I have so many windows open on my computer. Okay, thank you so much. We are going to move to our next speaker. We're going to hear from Natty Hoffman. Natty Hoffman is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors from Slovakia. She has been on the board of Boston 3G and has been a speaker for 3G New York. Natty spent her childhood in Israel and performed Israeli military service. She currently lives in Somerville, Massachusetts with her husband and 2 kids. In 2010, Natty traveled to Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Poland, and visited the hometowns of her ancestors, as well as visiting Auschwitz, where many of her family members were killed. 2 years later, she flew to Berlin to engage in a dialogue group with descendants of Nazis, which was a life-changing experience. So Natty, without further ado.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and thank you everyone for joining us. This is my grandmother. Hang on one second. My screen blanked out. Sorry about this. All right, let me reshare. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is my grandmother. Her name was Lily. Her number was 2870, which is a very low number, a very early number. So I knew she was one of the first Jewish people to enter Auschwitz, but I didn't know much growing up about her. And then she died in 2008. After the war, all I knew is that she came back and that no one in her family survived. She married my grandfather, and they moved to Israel, which is where my mom was born, and then I was born later in Israel as well. My grandparents did live in Germany. My grandfather was actually a diplomat for the Israeli government there. And my mom recalls visiting them and them sitting in a restaurant And, it was all very pleasant, but my grandfather would lean over and whisper and say to them, "You see all the older people here. I wonder what they were doing, a few years back." So there was always an undercurrent of the Holocaust in our lives, even though they didn't discuss it in detail. This is me and my grandmother in the summer. I moved to the States when I was about 13 years old. And my grandmother either wore a long sleeve shirt or she would put a Band-Aid that would cover her tattoo when she visited us in the States. And so I always saw that as something that was shameful, something she didn't want to talk about. She was from Slovakia. I was actually in the Czech Republic in the year 2000 for the first time in Prague. And it felt very strange for me because it was familiar and unfamiliar. So the language that they spoke was something that my grandmother also spoke. Slovak and Czech are very similar. But I didn't speak the language, and I felt like everyone was, kind of looked like me. There were foods that I remembered from home, but it wasn't my country, right? It was a home that was lost to our family. My grandmother died in 2008, and after she did, my mom said she really wanted us to all take a trip together to the lands of where they were from. My grandparents never did go back themselves, and I think they were unwilling, unable to do it because of the trauma that they experienced. But my mom wanted us to go. And one of the things that I said to her is I said, we really have to find out what their stories were, because it was important to go and show up there and have a more exact understanding of what happened, not to be in this position that I was in when I first visited, which was that I don't know how my family's connected to this place and I don't know what happened to them. So I started to investigate. And by the way, that's one of the things that I recommend to anyone is if you do plan to take a trip to Europe or to the places where your family's from, you really want to try and gather as much knowledge and do as much research as possible so that you go into it knowing, where your family was. And so I sort of did research, and there were 3 things that really helped me. The first one was the testimony of a friend of my grandmother who was with her in Auschwitz almost all the way from the beginning to the end. And that was incredibly helpful. My brother actually recorded it, and so we have it. And it was extremely helpful to understand what she went through. The second one was the book 999, which was about the first official Jewish transport to Auschwitz, which was actually full of Jewish girls from Slovakia. They were all 16 and 17 years old. In the course of my research, what I found out is that my grandmother was actually on the 3rd transport, which arrived only a few days later. So her experience was very similar to the experience of these girls. And this book actually just became a movie. And so if anyone's interested, I can give you the website. And what I found out is that, and the third part of my research was some personal family documents. So family documents and photo albums that my grandmother had. What I found out is that she went from Topolčany, Slovakia to Auschwitz, where she spent almost 3 years, which is really an incredible amount of time to spend in Auschwitz. Most people did not spend that much and actually survived. She worked in what was called the Canada warehouses, which were the warehouses that sorted the belongings of all the people who just arrived. And it was called that way because it was a quote unquote place of plenty. And she was there. She was basically, a witness to the genocide at the largest camp in Europe. She also survived a death march and driven in open cars to a camp called Ravensbrück. As they were evacuating Auschwitz, they sent whoever was alive, who could still walk, who was a woman, to Ravensbrück, which was a women's camp in Germany, and she was later liberated by the U.S. Army. So those are my parents, Emil and Vera. Lily was my grandmother, and she had married Raphael. And I found out through documents a little bit more about her family. Her dad, Samuel, her mom, Regina, her sisters, Valerie and Malvina, everyone with the black ribbon perished in the Holocaust. And I found out that her sister, Malvina, actually was married and had a husband and a small child who was about 1 year old. This was something that I didn't know anything about until I was a child. So I didn't actually know that my mom had a cousin who perished in the Holocaust. And that's from my grandmother's photo album. That's Regina and Samuel, her parents. That's Malvina and Leopold, the sister and the brother-in-law. And that is baby Palco, who was her nephew. And I actually named my youngest child, his middle name is Palco. I named him after him. This was the railroad station from where my family was taken. It was a very strange feeling to be there. The guide said that, you know, these tracks, which are now obviously modern, are the same tracks that my grandparents and my family were taken in cars to Auschwitz. And for me, it was just, I could not imagine growing up, you know, being at that strange train station and knowing what happened to my family. And so it actually made me more sensitive to other people's hardships and stories. For example, it made me think about, for the first time, what is it like for a Black person in America whose ancestors came here as slaves? That's not something I ever thought about before. But after this experience, I did. I became more sensitive to other people's hardship stories. So we visited Auschwitz as part of our family trip. Another thing that I recommend is if you go to Auschwitz or a camp, try to do it at the end of your trip because you will not have a lot of appetite after that. So that's my brother and that's my sister and I felt sort of just a little bit, you know, just giddy energy, I would say. Not giddy. Giddy is not the right word. It's more like nervous energy. I felt like I was on edge being there. And I sort of, it was really the first time that I sort of viscerally understood what happened to my family and started to ask the question, how could this have happened? And, you know, how could this have happened? How could humanity have let this happen? And I didn't have an answer. And I got very angry and I sort of felt like, you know, talking to myself wasn't enough. And asking this question of myself wasn't enough. And so my next trip, 2 years later, was actually to One by One, which is a dialogue group in Germany. And I actually spoke to descendants of Nazis, which was a very life-changing experience. I know my time is almost up. So I'm just going to skip ahead to, this is our dialogue group. We had six people of Jewish background and 6 people of German background, and each person actually told their story and explained how did the Holocaust affect my life. That was the question that we were trying to answer. The Germans had varying degrees of, the German descendants had varying degrees of involvement in the war that their ancestors had, all the way from innocent Germans to, you know, descendants of high Nazis. And it was very interesting for me to hear about just the complexity that continues to exist for Germans in terms of the experience from the war. And I also felt like there was incredible shame and guilt that still existed in descendants, even grandchildren, even though they did not, you know, obviously take part in the atrocities. And so I know this was like, didn't have a lot of time to talk through this, but those were my 2 trips.
Thank you so much, Natty. Let me do my little movement to our next speaker. So our next and our final speaker is Miriam Lipsky. Miriam Lipsky is the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. So technically she is a 2G and a 3G. She is the director of the Platform for Excellence in Teaching and Learning and is an adjunct faculty member in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Miami, where she designs and leads educational programs to promote a culture of belonging. Dr. Lipsky leads UM's Intergroup Dialogue Initiative, where she teaches a course for undergrads on creating belonging through dialogue, and created the U Dialogue program on intergroup dialogue for faculty and graduate students. Miriam will be sharing the story of her grandfather, Herman, and the very difficult strategic choices that he made during the Holocaust that kept him and his family alive. Herman was a very young doctor, starting his own medical practice in a small town outside of Vienna, when a letter he received in the mail changed everything. Forced to flee from his home and homeland, he would start over in Belgium, only to find himself quickly on the run again to yet another country far, far away. Miriam will be discussing traveling to Belgium to research her family's time there. So Miriam?
Thank you so much, Sophie. Let me share my screen here. Okay. All right, so similar to Lisa, my trip was connected with an academic conference. My sister was invited to speak at a conference in Belgium, or actually in the Netherlands. And so since Belgium was right close by, we went together to do some research in advance of her conference. So I will say this all started with a box, this whole journey into the family history, a box that I found under the stairs at my parents' house when they were moving. And around the same time, there was a note from, or another webinar from 3G Philly about the book Born Survivors, and they were having a book club. And so I signed up and I almost didn't go. And that night I was tired and I said, okay, I'm just going to go to this book club and not even put my camera on. But when I got there, there were very few participants. And so I put my camera on, and that's where I say it was serendipity. It was Bashert. There was another participant in that small group at the book club named Levi, and he will come into this story as I go along. So the early years of my family, similar to other people, I share a map. So my grandfather was born in Tust. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation. My grandmother in Buchach, which is all in the region known as Galicia, which is Poland. Now it's part of Ukraine. It was part of Poland. But before the First World War, both families moved to Vienna. And then my grandfather served in the army in Vienna in World War I. And after that, went to medical school, as mentioned in the intro, and became a doctor. And so in 1922, he graduated from medical school and was appointed as a doctor in a small town outside Vienna known as Fürstendorf. And so these are some photos from the early years there in Fürstendorf, where you see pictures of my grandfather, my grandmother, and my dad, who was born there. But things changed in 1938. Was a big year. So first, my grandfather received a letter telling him that he was once again to report for military service as a doctor. I don't know if he reported to go to military service and was denied because he was Jewish, or if he realized that because he was Jewish, he wasn't going to go. In our family, my grandparents really talked very little. I was told not to ask them about this period of time because it was too painful. So I have reconstructed a lot of this from some stories that my grandmother told to my mother, who was her daughter-in-law, and from these documents that I found in the box under the stairs. So he got this letter. Don't know if he reported or not. Then he got another letter about 2 months later telling him that he would no longer be allowed to practice medicine because of the laws that had been passed. And then a month or so later, another letter saying he would no longer receive any payments that were due to him from insurance companies for patients he had treated. So he was no longer able to make a living in Austria, and decided that he should leave and go to Belgium and see if he could find work there. So he traveled to Belgium. My grandmother and my father stayed behind, apparently living with her parents for a while. But then she was told that she would now have to work. I think they put her to work cleaning public bathrooms in somewhere in Vienna, and she quickly realized that that was going nowhere fast. And so she took my father and went to join my grandfather, her husband, in I originally thought it was Brussels, but it was actually in Antwerp, where my grandfather had found work in a pharmacy in a town, in part of town that didn't have a lot of doctors, and he was working as a doctor out of the back of a pharmacy. So when my grandfather left, his passport was not stamped with a red J. When my grandmother left, as you see in the slide here, her passport was stamped with a big red J, Jude, meaning they were Jewish, and you see the Nazi stamps on the passports. It gives me chills. So I will share for this research, there were two sources that were really helpful. So first, Kaserna Dosen Memorial Museum and Research Center on Holocaust and Human Rights, which is it's between Brussels and Antwerp. And this was the place that Levi, who was in that 3G book club, suggested to me. And there's an archivist there named Dorian Stiven. There are several archivists, but Dorian was the one that Levi had worked with, and I got in contact with her as well. And at this memorial, Holocaust Memorial Museum, they have records of all the people who were in Belgium during World War II and who came through Kaserna Dosen. Kaserna Dosen was a transit camp. And so I was able to find out from the archivist, Dorian Stiven, that my great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother, had actually passed through Kaserna Dosen before being sent to Auschwitz during the war. And so, and I said to the archivist, I understand that at this museum, there's a wall of photos. Would you like me to send a photo of my great-grandmother so she could be on the wall? And she said, oh, no need. We already have a photo of her, and it's already up on the wall. So I was shocked. They had the photo that was from her passport or something that she needed to get into Belgium right before the war. So that was one piece. The other piece was that my father and my grandparents got out of Belgium before the war, before Belgium was part of the war. So to find any records for them, because I wanted to find out where they had lived, what houses they had lived in, and so forth, I had to contact the National Archives of Belgium, which I found out from Dorian Stiven, and pay to have scans made of all the records that had my grandparents' names on them, which I did, and it was very helpful. And then when I went to visit, I took all those scans, and Dorian Stiven, because they were in either Flemish or Dutch, she was able to translate them for me to let me know what was in them and what had happened with my family. So this is one of the missing pieces. So I found out that my grandparents and my father, they lived in 3 different buildings in the approximately year that they were in the Antwerp area. 2 of them looked like they had been rebuilt, so we didn't really take pictures, but this one here is one where they lived before they were able to get passage out of Belgium to Mexico. And so that's my grandparents and my dad on the ship. I found this image of it was the Leerdam, which the archivist was able to tell me from all the documentation that she had. So that was the ship that they were able to leave. They had tried to leave to go to different places. Again, in these documents, I found out they had tried to go to Australia. They had tried to go to the United States. They had tried to go to England, but none of that worked out. And apparently my grandmother's passport had expired, and they would not let them board a ship with her expired passport. So that was a problem. I also found out about my great-grandparents, my grandfather's parents, my grandmother's parents. So this is Nathan and Lucy Glazer. There's my grandfather's parents, and they lived in this house in Antwerp. And this was the address that the archives had on file for them. It was also the address that they gave after the war when they left. And I had heard one story from some family members and from my mother that she got through my grandmother that my great-grandmother and great-grandfather had somehow survived during the war, that they were hidden in an attic. But it turns out, I think that they were perhaps not hidden in an attic, they may have been able to live in their home apparently on the third floor of this house in Antwerp with help from some of their neighbors. But when things got rough and the neighbors didn't have enough food to share with them, apparently my great-grandmother would go out at night, and apparently my great-grandfather never left the house because he was a great risk of being rounded up and sent to a camp. So, I mean, both of them were, but somehow she was younger, she went out, she found food somewhere, and they were able to survive through the war. And the archivist said there are some stories of people in Antwerp who simply didn't go out, and so they were not rounded up or caught. Not so lucky for my grandmother's parents, Rita Cohn and Abraham Cohn, who are shown here. When they got to Belgium, they all came from Vienna. They lived in this house here. But as soon as Belgium was drawn into the war, my great-grandfather Abraham Cohn was arrested and he was sent to multiple camps in France. He eventually escaped from one of the camps and was able to make his way to Mexico, where he knew that my grandparents and father were living. Unfortunately, my great-grandmother, Rita Cohn, when Abraham was rounded up, she, probably didn't have so many assets. They lived in this house with the red door, but then afterwards she lived with another family in this house, which is like a pretty nice house. I guess she rented a room from them, but at some point, as I mentioned before, was rounded up, ended up at Caserna Dosin, and eventually at Auschwitz, where she was murdered on the day that she arrived. And so this is the document that on the right that my grandmother received years later, confirming what had happened to her mother. So I just want to share a couple books that I highly recommend if you haven't read them, because I'm a reader, I'm a nerd. So We Were Lucky Ones, which is just parallels some of the parts of my family's story in a spooky way. So it's a novel, but based on a true story. So, and it's now a series apparently on Hulu. And this book, The Lost, A Search for 6 of the 6 Million, which traces Daniel Mendelsohn's path in looking for members, finding out what happened to 6 members of his family who perished as well. So happy to answer any questions people have about the story, but hopefully I stuck to my time, and that's a bit about my family.
Thank you so much, Miriam. So we are now going to go into our kind of question answer panel time. So I have received a couple of questions, and then we have a couple of questions that I have questions for you all as I am preparing to do my own trip to Poland and visit some sites this upcoming fall. So I'm gonna ask a couple of questions that came from members of the audience. If anybody does have a question, please feel free, to still put it into the chat. So one question, which is directed towards Becky, is if your family knew, did your relatives discuss any resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto? There's this audience member noted that there was a JTA article that was published after the announcement of the first deportation that said that there was panic in the ghetto and people believed that deportees would be killed. So there was a lot of like chaos and some knowledge of what was going to happen. Can you speak at all to that? Was there any talk of that?
My grandfather, so he had been in yeshiva in Warsaw when he was, a teenager, and it was because of what he was seeing in Warsaw that made him flee. And he had tried to get the family members that were from the smaller towns and shuttles also to leave, but they couldn't, or they wouldn't. When we were in Warsaw, he was not in the Warsaw Ghetto, though. His story is a very long, interesting one that I didn't have time to share. But when we were in Warsaw, we did visit the markings of the ghetto are all over the city. I mean, even though the city was basically destroyed, there are still markers on the ground where the walls were. There's a bunker where, as you mentioned, there was a resistance mounted. I actually had, from some of my notes from the visit in Warsaw, the Mordechai Anilowicz and other Jewish resistance fighters that died there during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There's also a wall where with the names of people who they knew were deported from the ghetto to many camps. And then in the there's a incredible museum in Warsaw, the Paulin Museum, which traces 1,000 years of Jewish history in Poland. And there is more discussion in much more detail. I mean, it's not just about the Holocaust, but about a lot of the different resistance and uprisings and kind of what happened in the city. And so, all of that is to say that, we had also spent several days in Warsaw. Even though my grandfather, I mean, he studied there, he wasn't in the ghetto, but it was very powerful and educational to be there, and also to visit also the places like the Warsaw Uprising Museum, not the ghetto uprising, but the Uprising Museum from the Polish perspective, which is quite a fascinating place.
Thank you. So I think the next couple of questions are for any of our presenters, so please feel free if you would like to answer any of them. So for the first one, if anybody would like to speak a little bit to the research and the planning process, and as part of that, thinking about how did you decide to take on this kind of exploration?
I can talk a little bit about the research and the planning. I know that a few others talked about it in their actual presentations. For me, it was quite interesting. So my grandmother, I knew a little bit about Hungary. I knew the town she was from, same with my grandfather. But because her and her three sisters survived the war, they went to Israel afterwards. And then my grandmother came to America, but her sisters ended up going back to Hungary to visit and to show their descendants, their children and grandchildren, where they were from. So for me, it was really interesting because we had like, photographs and actual, conversations had with my grandmother's sisters of like, this was our home. This was our temple. This is where so-and-so, like my father's grave is. So I was able to get all of that information from my cousins in Israel who had gone with my grandmother's sisters. And then for us, it really became a lot of a photo hunt. It's like I mentioned in a few things, I would look at my cousin's photograph from 20 years ago and then try to, go find, they said, oh, it's at the top of the hill in the city center. So it was just really interesting that we were able to, my grandmother never went back to Hungary, but we were able to get the information direct from the source of her sisters who had lived there and then went back. So for me, that's how it was done.
Thank you. And was there, and this is a question from the audience that's very relevant, and in hindsight, having undertaken these travels and this research and everything, is there anything that any of you kind of like wish you had done either differently to prepare or something that you had added into the preparation? So just, I guess after having actually gone, is there something that you think would have been helpful for you in preparation?
I can say that like the information that Levi had shared with me about Caserna Dosen, and it was something that clicked, that name sounded familiar, and then I went back and found it on the notice about my grandmother's death, or great grandmother's death. But that opened up a world of information. So I think our trip was already planned and we had a certain amount of time allocated, and I was doing the research as we were about to go. And I think it would have been better. I would have planned better and taken more time if I had known just how much the museum alone, we could have spent many hours there, but we just didn't have time. And so I think, making sure you have all your planning done and as much research as possible done before you go will ensure that you allow the right amount of time.
Yeah, I also wanted to just add, so, as many know, the train networks in a lot of Europe are great, and it's easy to get around by train and public transit in many places. Well, when you're trying to visit some of these small towns, it's not the way to go. And actually, this really impacted our trip because the plan was to visit Vengrove, Kosolaki, and Treblinka because they were, very close to each other, as I talked about. I mean, these were, some of the first towns that were liquidated and sent to Treblinka. Well, we, even with doing some research in advance on the trains, it became clear that they did not run frequently enough. They did not run to these small towns, and you really needed a rental car. And we had a whole issue with a babysitter for my young son, who obviously, could not come with us to Treblinka, not showing up, then prevented my husband from bringing us in the rental car, me from being able to get the rental car, ended up having to take an Uber an hour and a half from Warsaw to Treblinka. And, we made it. It was very important for us to, make it. That's why we were there. But just some of these logistical things and relying on transit is very difficult. And so if your relatives were from smaller towns, I would say definitely making sure you have the rental car, have the international driver's license, everything lined up, because unfortunately that meant, even though we didn't know necessarily like buildings or houses or things to go to in those towns, I still very much regretted that we weren't able to actually make it to those towns because there was no transit there.
Gotcha. Thank you. Megan, a fellow 3G Philly board member, and who has done some of this travel also. Megan, you said that you had something to add.
Yeah, I just, on top of what has already been shared here in terms of planning, I totally second what Becky is saying about renting a car. And something that we did not realize, because as Americans, we tend to think of like the EU as like one entity in a way. You need a different highway pass for every country. You can do it online, it's like super easy, but that is something to be aware of, because you could end up with tickets if you don't buy that pass. And bring your passport with you just in case. Like, again, Eurozone or like EU, technically you don't need it to cross the border. And I actually was okay. Like, so my grandmother's family was from a town that's on the border of Austria and Hungary, and we were staying in Hungary, and like went back across the border a couple times, and like one day nobody was there, another day, and so like I left my passport in our Airbnb, and another day like there was somebody on the border and they were like, technically I have to check your documents, but they took my license, so like it's okay, like, because technically they shouldn't require a passport, but just to be on the safe side, next time I definitely would. And the other thing I would say is just like make sure you have built in some time for like unplanned days. I definitely think like we could have planned our trip better and like more in advance, but we totally lucked out and ended up getting a last minute appointment with Jewish Welcome Services, because somebody in Vienna. So also, if anybody here is like thinking about Vienna or Austria, like I highly recommend you get in touch with Jewish Welcome Services. They are super helpful and they know everyone and they can make those introductions for you. The thing is that they're really slow in getting back to you. And they book up appointments, like, because there's literally like 2 or 3 of them. They book up like months in advance. So we happened to look out, somebody had canceled at the archives are the ones that book out in advance. So we got to Jewish Welcome Services. They put us in touch with people at the archives in Vienna, and they were like, actually, we have a cancellation for like this Friday at this time. We were like, yes. So, and we couldn't have done that if everything that was like super planned. And the other thing is like to have make sure you do some things that are maybe a little bit not Holocaust touristy. Because as I think, everyone who spoke mentioned, it's very emotional, like to whether it's visiting a grave site of like where you actually do get to visit a grave site, whether it's visiting a memorial in a concentration camp or visiting these towns, or, as one of you mentioned, this is like the home that was taken away from us. And so it can be very, just like super emotional. And so I think something that we did do well was building in some extra time to just kind of like have a chill day and not making ourselves go all the time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, as I've started planning, the big recommendation from my supervisor at work, and I'm at the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, and she said, this is your job, and this is your everyday. Make sure that you're not filling every single day of this trip with Holocaust tourism, and that it is just so intense. So that makes a lot of sense. Another question, and we've talked about in each of the presentations, there's kind of been noting that, there are survivors and there are children of survivors and grandchildren of survivors who, decide that this isn't something that they want to undertake, that they do not want to go back to see these spaces. And then there are those of us that do want to go back and to see these spaces. Was there any, hesitation to undertake this kind of exploration and travel, or any pushback from, members of your family? And just if anybody had any of those kinds of experiences or thoughts.
This is not, it's related. It's actually a trip that we have yet to take. So my husband's family is from Rhodes. They're actually Sephardic Jews. And I really, really want to go. And he's utterly uninterested. And it's actually, it's kind of interesting for me because I always assumed that he would be interested in going, but he's just like, this is not a place that welcomed us, and I'm just not. And same thing, we had a chance for him and for our kids to get Spanish citizenship, and he was like not interested. And so I think it's like very, very personal for each individual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can speak to kind of similar to Natty. So I'm going to now switch over to my husband's side of the family, who again, I mentioned quickly, his family's from Austria. And this past summer, we took all of our kids, extended family, grandparents, everyone. We went to Austria, and we actually got our 3 children Austrian citizenship. So that they're EU citizens, so that, they can do what they want later in life. And it was kind of, reparation. And the idea first came up, it was my husband's brother. And I was like, absolutely not. No way. My kids are not going to be Austrian citizens. No. And then even going to Austria, I was like, I cannot hear the German language. I'm not okay with that. And so it took, and my parents were actually on the Zoom. My mom was like beside herself that my children would become Austrian citizens, that we would go to Austria, that we would do any of this. And so it's just, there was a lot of like soul searching of like, well, should we do this? Like in the end, it's only beneficial for our children. So we might as well, take what we can since they've taken so much from us. So there was a lot of hesitation with that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear, and even thinking within my own family about like the language part of it that you mentioned about like hearing German. And my father decided to take German in high school when he had the option to do so. And just even hearing about that relationship between him telling my grandparents that he was going to do that, and them not having a good association with the language, but he really wanted to learn it. It's interesting how, and as you said, Natty, how personal it is, just to each person. So I'm going to have one more question that are just, if there are any, you all talked about this in each of your presentations, but if there are any, kind of last takeaways that you want to share, with the group, we'd love to hear, but also appreciate that has been shared a lot, within each presentation. But if there's any kind of like last thoughts, last takeaways that you'd like to share with us.
I just wanted to share that, it's interesting because it was actually the result in the process of traveling in Poland and reflecting on my experiences there, that made me decide ultimately, after actually many years of considering it, to pursue the process of Polish citizenship for myself, and by extension for my family, for my son. But I have a lot of mixed feelings about it, as Lisa shared. And in some ways, I wish I had pursued it earlier, because actually in this process of getting some of the documents and research, I hired a company that specializes in doing this, and most of their clients are actually the descendants of Holocaust survivors from Poland, and Jewish. We have found more documents. They found, marriage license, death certificates, so far from Łódź and from the Łódź ghetto, and for all these documents, and this is, much more than I was able to get from the Holocaust Museum in DC. We could not find any records from my grandparents or after they passed. And so in some ways, if I had started the process earlier, I might have had some of these documents, and maybe that could have been incorporated into this particular trip. But I'm in this process now with the research, and it's going to, take more time to get it. But and we're still waiting to get the documents from my grandfather's side from a different, region. But anyways, just to say that, then maybe I would have even more to share. Like some of the other presentations here that had, that were, had some of these records that now I'm finding and being able to share with my mom and with other members of our family.
Thank you, Becky. And Natty.
Yeah, I would say I would encourage everyone to do two things. So the first one is, if you do have surviving and still living relatives who may have or know information, whether firsthand or even secondhand, there is nothing that can even parallel firsthand experience. And that window is closing if it's not already closed. And so that would be the first thing that I would say. And don't be shy about asking, because you will never know what you'll find. I've pursued it with relatives that I'd never spoken to, and have gotten incredible amounts of information that I never thought I would have in my possession. So that's one thing. And the second is be generous in sharing it with family members, because the other thing that I've also found is I have many these sort of third and fourth cousins who I know about and who have no idea about their great grandparents and that story, and were really surprised when I actually approached them and really appreciated learning about the story. So those are my two tips.
Thank you. Miriam? Yeah.
So I would just echo some of what Becky said about the planning, and really, like, when we got to the town Mechelen, where Kaserne-Dosen is located, it was just a mile from the train station. We thought we would get an Uber or a cab, and we had our heavy suitcases and backpacks, and my sister and I literally rolled these suitcases over cobblestone streets for over a mile to get to the museum and then back, because there were no Ubers and there were no cabs, and the train station was just like a little stop. There was nothing there. And so doing that advanced planning and planning for the unexpected, I think, and traveling as light as possible probably would all be recommendations.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank all of our speakers for their incredibly informative and interesting and really amazing presentations. It is really interesting and really like heartwarming and really impactful and touching, I think, to hear these stories of familial history and familial history exploration and personal self-discovery. And, you know, I'm personally so interested in this topic as I'm starting my own research. So I really like personally thank you all. As the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and children of Holocaust survivors, you know, we are committed to sharing our grandparents and parents' stories of, you know, where hatred can take us, you know, while working to create a more tolerant world. And as you know, as we said to kind of start this program and about what all of us are doing as members of this 3G community and 2G community, is, you know, that we are seeking to really honor those that both were lost and that survived and that we got to have relationships with. And we're honoring them through education and advocacy and peer support. So our hope is that you're walking away this afternoon, you know, feeling empowered to explore your own family stories. And I just want to note, we are, you know, thrilled to be able to offer our programs, all the 3G groups to offer programs free of charge. And we hope that you'll consider donating to, you know, our 3G chapters so that we can continue our work to educate on anti-Semitism and Holocaust awareness and about all of these stories. So we just want to thank you for being here, our audience members, and we hope to see you at another event soon. So thank you everyone for being here, and please enjoy the rest of your Sunday and be safe.